speaker is a retired Army officer. He served several tours in combat zones. So after serving his country in the Army, he's now serving his country and his district in the United States House of Representatives. So it is my honor to introduce to you Congressman Chris Gibson.
Well, hey, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be with you. And, you know, I want to acknowledge, of course, this club that's been in existence now since 1880. And I appreciate what you guys do to organize and help us bring forward a message of empowerment for our folks. And, you know, I'm excited to be with you today. And I appreciate that introduction. And would say just a little bit more on some of the things you wouldn't find in my bio that I think you would find relevant. And the first of which is I grew up in a working class. My dad was he was in the building construction trades, and he worked for Otis Elevator. And in times that he was working, life was good. Had a living wage, and family was flourishing. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. We were an Irish Catholic family. Actually, they were all Democrats by the time they came over on the boat. And, you know, I was the oldest of 4 children. The late 70s were really a hard time for our family. My dad spent a fair amount of time out of work. About half the time he was out of work, 78, 79, and into 80. So this was, these were the days where I was 14, 15, and 16 years old. So I was sort of like the Michael Keaton, you remember that from Family Ties? You know, I'm coming of age and very patriotic community, and I grew up, you know, I go to school and I would listen to the teachers and read, and felt very fortunate to be an American. You know, reading about our history and all the opportunities that are found in our country. And then I would come home and I would see my dad at work, and I would watch the TV and I'd watch the president. He seemed like a very moral man at the time, but you know, he was talking in terms of wearing sweaters and turning thermostats down, and it just seemed like that there was a disconnect between what I was learning during the day and what I was seeing when I got home and watched on TV in the evening. It made me question and wonder if our best days are behind us. So you can imagine I was in the space to be influenced when Ronald Reagan came to the fore. He was somebody I found, he was very optimistic. He had a vision that really brought people together, didn't divide, and was one that was for opportunity, for a flourishing form of life for everybody, and for strength. This was at a time, you'll recall, that it wasn't just my family that was struggling. Up until that point in our history, we had actually had what's called a concomitant relationship between unemployment and inflation. Whenever unemployment was high, at least inflation was low. And then when inflation was high, at least unemployment was low. That was sort of the concomitant relationship. In the late 70s, somehow, economists couldn't figure it out, but we had high unemployment and high inflation. Misery index. He came in. They had to create a new term. It was called stagflation. And so, you know, I actually tried to get my dad to vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980. He wouldn't do it. He voted for Jimmy Carter. But here's the good news. He voted for Reagan in '84. He never changed his party affiliation. Yeah, exactly. You know, he went to his grave what he described as a Truman Democrat. But after '84, he didn't vote for Democrats anymore. He would vote for Republican candidates going forward. But, you know, I think in some ways that's a microcosm of a story that you see often, you know, in terms of Irish Catholics who made that move from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And for me, it was really one of a vision of empowerment and strength, strength properly defined. You know, you think about what it was like in the late 1970s. We had the issue with Iran, and remember those hostages? And it just seemed like that the country had a hard time, you know, projecting the kind of peace through strength approach, which you can really date back to the founding of our country. And I think this is an important issue going forward, is properly understanding what our role is in the world. Because quite candidly, what I hear on the news today, I don't think that it's properly contextualized or even described, because I think we're left with false choices. We're left with either, you know, supporting all war all the time or weakness. I don't think either approach is right for us. If you think about what was one of our earliest mottos, right? Don't tread on me, right? And what was implied is if you don't tread on me, we won't tread on you. And you know, this was this whole idea that I think Reagan helped bring to the fore, was this idea of peace through strength. So we went through a period of revitalizing our capability in our armed forces. And, you know, a lot has been written and discussed about how do you know, secure a place in the world where we can continue to have this incredible flourishing form of life and be a positive influence on the world. And so when you think about the threats out there, I'm going to take a second just to sort of unpack this idea, because I think it's important, is, you know, we have two kinds of threats that we basically face in the world today. We have threats from nation states. That would be, you know, the issues we were reading about Russia, and you're reading about with Iran and North Korea and potentially with China. And then we have issues of transnational actors. This is the Islamic State, right, and other terrorist organizations. So as it relates to nation states, I subscribe to this theory of where peace through strength can make a difference in that realm. Now, keep in mind, with transnational actors, it's different. We can talk about that maybe in the Q&A if you want to go into further detail about how I think we should address the Islamic State. But as it relates to Reagan and why I became a Republican, I think he got this part right because, you know, why is it that North Korea doesn't attack South Korea? Because they're good guys? There's no evidence of that, right? There's no evidence of that. North Korea doesn't attack South Korea because they believe that the costs outweigh the benefits. That's a way to operationally define deterrence in terms of knowing it when you see it. Now, what is it that influences deterrence? And you know, big books have been written on this. Dissertations have been published on this. It's complex. I'll certainly yield that point, but I think you can actually distill it down to two factors: capability and will. If you have capability and you don't have will, you don't have deterrence. If you have will, but yet you don't have capability, you don't have deterrence. I think Reagan understood this. And that's one of the things that he did. He inspired me to enlist. I was a 17-year-old, basically somewhere between boy and young man at the time. And when you're 17, you actually need your parents' signature to join the military. And fortunately, my parents did sign that sheet. And I joined as the lowest rank you could possibly. I was an E1 private in the infantry in the New York Army National Guard. And I was inspired to join the military, understanding where President Reagan was trying to take our country. You bet, you know. But you know, so he went about it. This took the better part of a decade, right? I mean, if you think about how he restored capability, you don't do that overnight. It took time to restore that capability. And I grew up in that army, and we were very professional, and that means ruthless about the mistakes that we constantly would go through an after-action review, figure out what we did right and what we did wrong, and do it again, and keep practicing to get better. So while we were working on capability, Reagan was also being very disciplined and careful about what he said. You know, because you know, if you say something, if you draw a red line and then you don't enforce that, you undermine will. And that's part of this equation of peace through strength. You know, there was a moment in 1983 that I think some people kind of cocked their heads sideways about Ronald Reagan. They kind of cocked, they didn't quite sure how to understand President Reagan in this regard. It happened after the bombing, the tragic bombing where we lost Marines, right? Over 250 Marines were killed. But Reagan made an assessment at that point that it was in our best interest not to get sucked into the vortex of that conflict at that moment. He actually removed our military presence at the time. And I know that there was some ambiguity. What is Reagan? I thought he was, you know, the one for strength. This is important as it relates to today. Because what Reagan was he was using judgment to say that the way to get deterrence is to restore capability and make sure that, bless you, make sure that you don't end up stating something and don't back it up. In his judgment, it was better to reposition forces than to get sucked into a regional conflict that he didn't see an end state that was successful. But what he did do was stay true to this concept of peace through strength. And where were we by the end of the decade? We saw the end of the Soviet Union. You know, and nobody, if you read history, you know, the idea that this would end without a major war, I mean, it's just, you'd have a hard time finding a precedent for that this kind of major contestation. So what I'm telling you is that staying the course with Reagan's peace through strength approach ended up in a position where freedom was on the march. You know, and my first tour in the United States Rebel Army was in Berlin, Germany. So when I served there, I was there before the wall came down. And I want to tell you that I was there the day. You may have seen that video. It was June of 1987. when Reagan was at the Brandenburg Gate. And he said on that day, he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Yeah.
And I was there that day. You know, and I'll tell you, I will tell you, you know, when I was there, and this was somebody who I really had a strong belief in. I mean, I got goosebumps that day, but I'm also tell you in all candor that I said, "Oh, but that won't happen anytime soon." Just 2 years later, that happened. And you know, that was a moment for me, you might say an epiphany, that realized the possibilities of the strength of the internal consistency, and when you see values like the ones that we were projecting in the world. I think that was a moment of hope for all of mankind. And I think this is important as we move forward, as we try to understand what our role is, because I think it's our role to lead, but we don't necessarily have to lead with military force. We don't have to bomb every, you know, I don't think that that's the right approach, is for us to constantly be militarily involved. However, what we do need to do is have the world's strongest military as a deterrent to those who would try to tread on us, number one. And then the other piece of this is that we do lead with our greatest strengths. What is our greatest strengths? You know, certainly we're proud of our military, unmatched. We're certainly proud of our economy, even as much as we're challenged, we still have the world's largest economy as it relates to gross domestic product. But really, our greatest strength are ideas, as instantiated in our founding documents. You know, you think about that declaration. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I mean, there's a tendency to look back now and say, yeah, of course. But you know, at the time, that was radical. The idea that we could be self-governing, that was a radical idea. This was the era of divine right of kings and queens and aristocracies and courts. And we said, no, we can do this. We can pick our leaders for a period of time. They will go forward and they will make laws. We'll hold them accountable. And then they'll come back after a period of time. And, you know, this, we showed the world that this could be done. You know, and, you know, including the independent judiciary, which was really one of our major contributions. Others had looked at this in the past, and certainly Montesquieu and Spirit of Laws wrote about this, and others. But we actually made this happen because in the past, you had the judiciary was really mostly tied to the king or the queen. And so, you know, this idea of a self-governing people where we restrain power, government power, so that we can provide for maximum freedom and liberty, and we back that up with a Bill of Rights. This is really our greatest legacy, I think, for mankind. This hope, this possibility in us. And that is our greatest strength. So when we lead with that, I can tell you that in the course of my military career, I think I was in about 36 different countries. And our best day, other countries want to be like us for that reason. And so I'm an advocate on Capitol Hill. I'm an advocate for reforming the way we think and act. And I believe if we do that, you will see a situation where we can enact national security reform, and we can be safer for less money if we do this in a smart way. But I give you that by way of introduction. You won't find that in my bio because it's who I am. You know, having gone through this in the late 70s and seen my family struggle like this, and I was the first one ever to go to college. And for me, you know, what that meant is I worked in the National Guard. I got money from the National Guard. I worked at Key Bank. I did get the assistance of the Pell Grant and the TAP, and I had to take loans out. And I took about this is 1986 dollars, but I had about $8,000 worth of loans, and then I paid it back while I was in the U.S. Army. And, you know, when I went in the Reg Army after I finished ROTC, and I thought I'd serve 3 years and come back home. But, you know, I'm dating myself a little bit, but there used to be a show called Gilligan's Island. Remember that? Remember that was going to be a 3-hour tour? Mine was supposed to be a 3-year tour. And 3 years became 24 years. You know, and, you know, in that time, look, I mean, I had 4 tours to Iraq, but really everybody serving at that time. This is a standard story of folks who kept going forward and coming back. And, you know, it was a hard life, but it was a good life. But I want to also tell you that the U.S. Army takes care, the U.S. military takes care of their own. You know, Ramon is here today and appreciate his service in the United States Marine Corps, and he is mentioning that the VA, for all its challenges, you know, we want to hold it accountable, is looking after Ramon. And, you know, for me, the Army paid for, I went to graduate school, You know, and the Army sent me to Cornell, and I earned ultimately a PhD in government, and I taught for 3 years at the United States Military Academy at West Point from 1995 to 98. And, you know, that was a high privilege as well. And so, you know, I've always believed in the goodness of our country and the possibilities. And so in the summer of 2009, I was commanding a brigade in the 82nd Airborne Division, the 2nd Brigade of the 82nd. And this was the time, you may recall, the country seemed to be coming apart, moving in the wrong direction. And I found myself atypically, you know, complaining. I'm a guy with the glasses 5'6" full always. You know, and I found myself that summer complaining about what was going on. And I just decided at a certain point, I said, I'm not going to complain about it anymore. I'm going to do something about it. So I went into my commanding general and said, I'm going to retire from the Army, and I'm going to run for Congress. I fell out of his chair at that point. So, and I did that. And I got back home. I live around the corner from where I grew up now in a small village called Kinderhook, which is in Columbia County, about 30 minutes from Albany. My mom's still among the living. Dad went to heaven in 2008, but it's so nice to be back home. Yeah, we had Martin Van Buren that was from Kinderhook, the 8th President of the United States. But old Kinderhook, very good. And when I got back, I retired on the 1st of March of 2010, and I joked that I must be Ripley's, believe it or not, because I went from the world's, or the country's most esteemed public institution to the lowest esteem in the shortest amount of time. So, but, you know, I want to tell you that, I'm here today to tell you this, that even though the numbers may not be large here today, that I tell you this much, I believe that we're on the march. I believe our cause is on the march. You know, I see this. I was out in Buffalo about 10 days or maybe 2 weeks ago. I was in the North Country just a few days ago. I've been in Central New York. I've been in the Capital District, the Hudson Valley, and I've been on Long Island and in New York City.